Beauty, in the Gilded Age, was something you hid before you revealed it. Long before the gowns, the jewels, and the photographs meant to last forever, there was a private hour under gaslight where faces were altered, bodies corrected, and flaws negotiated with chemistry. Behind closed doors, the elite performed rituals no guest ever witnessed, whitening skin to near translucence, staining lips with poisons that promised vitality, binding waists until breath itself learned restraint. What the world called elegance was first assembled in silence. If you're drawn to history's quieter dangers and unspoken rules, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from tonight. These stories are meant to be shared softly, the way they once were, whispered rather than displayed. Tonight, we uncover the hidden beauty rituals of the Gilded Age elite, where refinement depended on risk, where luxury brushed dangerously close to harm, and where the pursuit of perfection demanded far more than anyone was ever meant to admit. Before the carriage doors closed and the gaslights along the avenue flared to life, there was always a quieter hour, an hour that belonged to preparation rather than display. In the private rooms of the Gilded Age elite, beauty was never spontaneous. It was assembled deliberately, with the same care one might give to balancing accounts or arranging a dinner seating. A face presented to society was not merely seen. It was evaluated, measured against unspoken standards that carried social consequence. This ritual began not with vanity, but with obligation. To appear in public was to submit oneself to inspection, and inspection demanded readiness. The mirror, tall and unforgiving, stood as the first witness. It did not flatter. It revealed redness where calm was expected, shadows where rest should have lived, pores and lines that hinted at strain, age, or appetite. These were not personal flaws. They were social liabilities, and so the face had to be corrected before it could be offered. Powder came first, not as decoration, but as erasure. The goal was not color, but absence, the removal of heat, the suggestion that blood itself had learned restraint. A pale complexion signaled a life untouched by labor, by sun, by excess. It implied quiet rooms, measured habits, and a body governed rather than indulged. To look flushed was to appear unregulated. To appear unregulated was to invite questions no one wished to answer. Hands moved with practiced calm. Jars were opened, their contents faintly sweet, faintly metallic, scents softened by rosewater and assurances printed in delicate script. The products promised improvement, not transformation. They did not claim to change a woman into something new, only to return her to what she ought to have been already. This distinction mattered. Improvement was respectable. Change suggested failure. The application itself followed an order that rarely varied. Creams to smooth, powders to mute. Rouge applied carefully, never enough to announce itself, just sufficient to suggest vitality without effort. The final result had to look inevitable, as though the face had simply awakened this way. Any sign of labor, the wrong shade, a visible line, a hurried touch, would betray the entire performance. Time was watched closely. Too long at the mirror suggested indulgence. Too brief suggested neglect. The correct balance was known instinctively, taught early, reinforced silently. Young girls observed their mothers, their aunts, the women who occupied the highest rungs of drawing-room authority. They learned not by instruction, but by repetition. Beauty, like posture, was absorbed through correction. Servants played their part without comment. Towels were warmed, brushes cleaned, pins passed at the correct moment. Their presence ensured efficiency, not intimacy. This was not a moment for conversation. It was a task. And tasks were completed quietly. What made this ritual particularly unforgiving was its invisibility. Society demanded perfection while denying the labor behind it. A woman who appeared flawless was praised for her natural qualities. One who showed effort was quietly diminished. The face, once complete, had to deny its own making. Yet beneath the calm surface of this routine lay a tension few acknowledged. The products used daily were trusted because they were familiar, not because they were understood. Discomfort was reframed as adjustment, irritation was patience, fatigue was dismissed as temporary. The mirror reflected success long before the body registered cost, And so, each evening, the face was prepared again, not because it brought joy, but because it brought safety. In a world where reputation could hinge on the smallest detail, the ritual endured. The powder settled, the mirror approved, and only then was the woman ready to be seen. The gaslight did not merely illuminate the room, it softened it. Under its glow, edges blurred, shadows gentled, and imperfections learned to recede. This was no accident. The private hour of preparation was designed to unfold beneath this particular light, where reality could be negotiated rather than confronted. Daylight was honest to the point of cruelty. Gaslight was accommodating. It forgave, if approached correctly. As dusk settled and the household quieted, this hour arrived with ritual certainty. Curtains were drawn, not to shut out the world, but to control it. Outside, the city moved on, hooves striking stone, voices dissolving into distance. But inside, time slowed. The room became a chamber of adjustment, where appearance was refined before it was released. Gaslight cast a steady amber haze across the mirror, warming skin tones, muting contrast, and lending a sense of composure to features that might appear harsher by morning. Fine lines softened, pallor appeared, deliberate rather than drained. Redness could be disguised as bloom. This light did not reveal truth. It presented an improved version of it, one closer to what society wished to see. Women learned quickly that this light required cooperation. Movements were kept unhurried. Abrupt gestures created shadows where none were desired. Stillness allowed the face to settle into its corrected form. Even breathing was adjusted, slow, controlled, invisible. The body itself learned to participate in the illusion. The objects arranged on the vanity reflected this quiet negotiation. Glass bottles caught the glow and refracted it gently. Porcelain jars appeared smoother, more reassuring. Labels written in elegant script promised restoration, purity, improvement. There were no warnings, only suggestions, calm language implying that refinement was both safe and necessary. Under gaslight, such promises felt credible. This hour was private by design. No guests were permitted. Husbands rarely intruded. Children were kept away. The process required concentration, and concentration demanded solitude. To be observed mid-preparation was to risk exposure, not of skin, but of effort. The illusion relied on secrecy as much as skill. Servants moved through this space with practiced restraint. They adjusted lamps, refreshed towels, replenished supplies, all without comment. Their presence supported the ritual without acknowledging it. Silence was part of the service. Questions were unnecessary. The routine repeated itself each evening with only minor variation. What made this hour especially powerful was its emotional weight. Here, alone with the mirror, a woman confronted the distance between expectation and reality. The gaslight eased this confrontation, but it did not erase it. Small flaws loomed larger in isolation, a patch of irritation, a faint shadow beneath the eyes. Each became a problem to solve before the night advanced. Solutions were applied patiently. Creams smoothed, powders settled. Rouge was adjusted and readjusted until it appeared accidental. Each step restored a sense of control. The face in the mirror grew calmer, more composed, more acceptable. Relief followed, not pleasure, but reassurance. Society would see what it expected to see. Yet the gaslight also concealed early warnings. Discoloration looked less severe. Irritation seemed temporary. Fatigue felt manageable. The light reassured when perhaps it should have questioned. Over time, this reassurance became dangerous. The body's objections were dimmed, rendered subtle, postponed. Still, the hour ended, as it always did. Lamps were adjusted for public rooms. Curtains opened. The private face became the public one. Whatever discomfort lingered was left behind with the mirror. Under gaslight, the transformation felt complete, and for another evening, it was enough. To be pale was not merely to be attractive, it was to be correct. In the Gilded Age, complexion served as evidence, a visible declaration of how one lived, and more importantly, how one did not. Skin untouched by sun implied distance from labor, from heat, from exertion, that suggested necessity rather than choice. Pallor was not weakness, it was authority rendered on the surface of the body. The ideal complexion hovered in a narrow range, light, even, and calm. Too much color suggested indulgence, emotion, or physical effort. Too little risked appearing unwell. The correct shade implied balance, a body governed carefully enough that blood did not rush uninvited to the face. Achieving this balance required constant attention. Nature could not be trusted to maintain it alone. Women learned early to monitor their own coloring with vigilance. A flush after climbing stairs was noted with quiet concern. Redness after a warm meal was watched closely. Even laughter, too sudden or unrestrained, carried the risk of betraying color where none was desired. Restraint extended beyond behavior and into circulation itself. Powders were selected with precision. Finely milled, delicately scented, they settled into the skin like a veil. Their purpose was subtraction rather than addition. Heat was muted. Shine disappeared. The face became an even field, prepared for inspection. When applied correctly, the powder did not announce itself. It simply suggested that the skin beneath had always been this way. The ritual was repeated daily because pallor was fragile. A single afternoon outdoors could undo it. A night of poor rest could stain it with shadow. The body was always threatening to reveal evidence of strain. The products promised defense against this exposure. They did not claim to deceive, only to correct. Medical language often accompanied these assurances. Advertisements spoke of cooling, soothing, balancing. Pallor was framed as health rather than its opposite. A pale face was said to indicate calm nerves, a refined constitution, a system unburdened by excess. In this logic, redness was not vitality, but imbalance. The absence of color was proof of control. Yet this proof demanded sacrifice. Outdoor pursuits were limited. Windows were managed carefully. Parasols became extensions of the body, not accessories, but barriers. The sun was not romanticized, it was avoided. Its warmth threatened more than comfort. It threatened status. Men praised the result without acknowledging the effort. Compliments spoke of delicacy, of natural refinement. Such praise reinforced the illusion that pallor was inherent rather than engineered. To admit otherwise would have diminished its value. Beauty was meant to appear effortless, even when it required constant vigilance. Over time, the pursuit of pallor reshaped daily life. Meals were adjusted to avoid warmth. Baths were timed carefully. Rest was enforced not for recovery but for appearance. The body learned that its natural responses were undesirable. Heat, exertion, even healthy color became something to suppress. The mirror reflected success while quietly ignoring cost. Skin that grew thin or sensitive was praised for its fineness. Lightheadedness was dismissed as delicacy. Weakness was reframed as refinement. The language surrounding pallor softened every warning. Discomfort was not danger. It was proof that the system was working. In this way, complexion became a moral statement. To maintain pallor was to demonstrate discipline, restraint, and social belonging. To fail was to invite speculation. Questions would arise, unspoken but sharp. Had one been careless? Had one worked too hard? Had one allowed life to leave its mark? So the powder settled again. The parasol was raised. The room stayed cool and dim. Pallor endured, not as preference, but as evidence. Fatigue in the Gilded Age was not understood as a condition, but as a confession. To look tired was to suggest a failure of management, of time, of nerves, of appetite, of temperament. Weariness implied that something had been allowed to slip. It hinted at excess emotion, excessive thought, or a body insufficiently governed. For the elite, this was intolerable. The signs were subtle but mercilessly scrutinized. A shadow beneath the eyes, a slackness at the corner of the mouth, skin that appeared dull rather than composed. None of these suggested illness in the conventional sense. They suggested strain. And strain carried implications that reached far beyond health. It implied vulnerability. The fear was not of exhaustion itself, but of its visibility. Everyone understood that society required energy. Dinners that stretched late into the night, conversations conducted with careful brightness, appearances maintained across seasons of obligation. Tiredness was expected. Displaying it was not. The body was allowed to feel fatigue only so long as it did not betray it. Mirrors became instruments of surveillance. Each evening, the face was assessed for signs of decline. A long day could leave its mark, and those marks had to be negotiated before the world was allowed to see them. Creams promised restoration, tonics suggested renewal. Powders softened the evidence, none claimed to cure fatigue. They promised concealment. Sleep itself was treated cautiously. Too much rest risked dullness, too little invited visible collapse. The correct amount was implied rather than defined, adjusted according to schedule rather than need. Rest was a tool, not a right. It existed to support appearance, not recovery. Products aimed at combating tiredness proliferated. Eye salves cooled and tightened. Facial waters claimed to refresh without stimulating. Fragrant preparations suggested cleanliness and alertness even when the body beneath remained strained. The language surrounding these remedies was careful. They did not accuse. They reassured. They implied that fatigue was temporary, manageable, correctable. Medical authority often reinforced this belief. Doctors spoke of nerves rather than exhaustion, of constitution rather than overextension. Tiredness was framed as sensitivity, a trait associated with refinement rather than weakness. The solution was moderation, not relief. Adjustments were recommended, never withdrawal. The social consequences of appearing tired were quietly severe. Invitations cooled, attention shifted. Concern, when offered, was edged with judgment. A woman who looked fatigued was assumed to be struggling, not physically, but socially. She was thought to be overwhelmed by her obligations, or, worse, unsuited to them. This pressure shaped behavior long before the mirror was consulted. Movements were controlled to preserve energy for public view. Emotions were restrained. Meals were selected not for nourishment, but for their effect on complexion and expression. The body learned to ration itself, saving its vitality for performance. Over time, this created a peculiar imbalance. The effort to appear rested became more exhausting than rest itself. Each correction demanded concentration. Each concealment required vigilance. The face once prepared carried the weight of expectation. It had to hold throughout the evening, through conversation and candlelight, without slipping. Gaslight assisted in this deception, softening shadows and lending warmth to features that might otherwise betray strain. But it could not erase fatigue entirely. It merely delayed its recognition. The body, denied acknowledgement, continued to register its limits quietly. Yet acknowledgement was precisely what could not be afforded. To admit tiredness was to risk being seen as fragile. Fragility invited oversight. Oversight invited loss of autonomy. And so, fatigue was managed privately, concealed publicly, and discussed rarely, if at all. In this way, the fear of looking tired became another discipline, another silent rule. The body could ache, the mind could strain. But the face, always the face, had to remain composed. Elegance was not acquired suddenly, nor was it chosen. It was introduced early, folded quietly into childhood long before its purpose was understood. In the homes of the Gilded Age elite, refinement was not delayed until maturity. It was practiced from the moment a child could sit still long enough to be corrected. Girls learned first through observation. They watched their mothers at the mirror, not openly, but from doorways and reflections caught in glass. They absorbed the order of movements, the seriousness with which small details were addressed. Beauty was never discussed as pleasure. It was treated as routine, something necessary, unremarkable, and expected. This was the lesson that lingered longest. Instruction followed soon after. A young face was not yet burdened with the same demands as an adult's, but it was already being prepared. Skin was washed carefully, dried without friction. Hair was brushed not for play, but for control. Posture was corrected gently at first, then with firmer insistence. Stillness was praised. Fidgeting was discouraged. The body was taught to anticipate judgment before it ever arrived. Manners and appearance were taught together, inseparable. A child who slouched or flushed too easily was reminded to compose herself. Excitement was moderated, laughter was softened, even play carried boundaries, as though the body might reveal too much if left unattended. Elegance was framed not as denial, but as protection, a way to move through the world without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Products appeared early as well. Mild powders, lightly scented waters, creams meant to soothe and prepare. They were introduced gently, described as harmless, almost medicinal. There was reassurance in routine. The act of application became familiar before its implications were understood. By the time stronger preparations were required, the ritual itself felt natural. This early training shaped perception. A young girl learned to see herself as an object to be maintained rather than a body to be inhabited. The mirror became a tool of guidance, not curiosity. Correction replaced exploration. Approval followed compliance. The reward for discipline was reassurance, soft praise, a nod of satisfaction, the quiet knowledge that one was doing as expected. Mistakes were corrected without drama. A careless gesture, a flushed cheek, hair out of place, these were addressed calmly, firmly. Shame was unnecessary. The system relied on repetition, not reprimand. Over time, the body adjusted. Movements grew economical. Expressions moderated themselves before intervention was required. What was never taught explicitly was choice. Elegance was presented as inevitability. To be born into privilege was to inherit its obligations. Appearance was one of them. A girl did not ask whether she wished to maintain herself this way. The question never arose. She was simply shown how. Boys, too, absorbed these lessons, though differently. They learned to expect elegance rather than embody it. The contrast reinforced the system. Refinement became something admired from a distance, its labor unseen. This division ensured its continuation. By the time childhood ended, the habits were already fixed. The rituals felt familiar, even comforting. Resistance seemed unnecessary, even strange. The body had been shaped not by force, but by guidance repeated often enough to feel like instinct. Elegance, learned young, did not announce itself. It settled quietly, becoming part of how one stood, moved, and appeared. And once learned, it was difficult to unlearn, no matter the cost. Stillness was not an absence of movement. It was an achievement. In the Gilded Age, to remain composed, to sit, stand, and exist without visible effort, was considered a mark of refinement more telling than any garment or ornament. Motion suggested unrest. Restlessness hinted at disorder. The disciplined body, by contrast, appeared calm because it had been trained to suppress its objections. From an early age, stillness was encouraged as a virtue. Children were praised for sitting quietly, for holding their posture, for keeping their hands composed in their laps. Movement beyond what was strictly necessary was corrected gently at first, then with increasing firmness. The message was subtle but persistent. The body should not draw attention to itself unless instructed to do so. This discipline extended beyond posture into expression. Faces were trained to remain neutral, pleasant, controlled. Surprise was softened, discomfort concealed. Pain, unless severe, was expected to pass unnoticed. To betray sensation was to acknowledge the body's demands, and demands were inconvenient. In drawing rooms and dining halls, stillness was closely observed. A woman who shifted too often appeared uneasy. One who fidgeted seemed distracted. Movement became a language, and the wrong gestures spoke volumes. The correct posture conveyed ease, even when none was felt. It implied confidence, breeding, and self-command. Corsetry reinforced this lesson physically. Restriction limited motion, making stillness easier to maintain once achieved. The body adapted to its constraints, learning to exist within narrow allowances. Breathing itself adjusted, shallower, quieter, controlled. The appearance of calm was supported by the architecture of clothing. Furniture, too, played its role. Chairs were designed for posture rather than comfort. Settees encouraged careful arrangement rather than relaxation. The body was always aware of its placement, its angles, its limits. Rest was permitted only in approved forms. The discipline of stillness was reinforced socially. Those who mastered it were praised implicitly. They were described as serene, composed, graceful. Those who struggled were noted quietly. No reprimand was necessary. Observation alone sufficed. The desire to belong ensured compliance. Yet stillness came at a cost. Muscles stiffened, circulation slowed, fatigue accumulated without release. The body, denied movement, stored its tension internally. This tension manifested later as headaches, faintness, aches dismissed as nerves. These symptoms were treated separately, never connected back to the discipline that produced them. Medical explanations often supported this separation. Discomfort was attributed to sensitivity rather than restraint. Remedies were offered to soothe rather than liberate. The system remained intact. Stillness was never questioned as a cause, only as a requirement. Over time, the discipline became internalized. Even when alone, the body resisted relaxation. Muscles held their shape. Expressions remained composed. Movement felt excessive, indulgent. The absence of correction did not bring freedom. It revealed how deeply the lesson had settled. Stillness, once learned, was difficult to abandon. It had become synonymous with safety. To relax too fully was to risk appearing unguarded, and unguarded bodies invited scrutiny. Thus, the discipline endured, not because it was comfortable, but because it was effective. The body learned to be quiet. Society rewarded the silence, and whatever strain accumulated beneath the surface was addressed later, privately, in ways that never disturbed the appearance of calm. To be seen was never a neutral act. In the Gilded Age, visibility carried consequence, and consequence carried judgment. A woman stepping into public space did so under an unspoken contract. She would be observed, evaluated, and quietly measured against standards that shifted without warning, yet were always enforced. Appearance was not merely noticed, it was interpreted. Judgment began before words were exchanged. A glance lingered on complexion, posture, dress. The smallest details, how the skin caught the light, how the body held itself in stillness or motion, were registered almost unconsciously by those trained to notice them. These observations rarely rose to speech. They settled instead into impressions, and impressions shaped reputations. What made this scrutiny particularly unforgiving was its inevitability. Withdrawal was not an option. Social life demanded participation, and participation demanded exposure. To attend was to be assessed. To abstain was to provoke speculation of a different sort. There was no safe position outside the gaze. Women learned quickly that judgment did not require malice. It thrived on habit. Drawing rooms functioned as quiet courts, where opinions were formed and filed away without ceremony. A woman who appeared unpolished one evening might find invitations thinning weeks later, with no explanation offered. The cause would never be named, but it would be understood. This understanding shaped behavior long before any gathering took place. Preparation became a form of defense. The mirror was consulted not for admiration, but for risk assessment. What might draw attention? What might invite comment? The goal was not distinction, but acceptability. To stand out was dangerous. To blend correctly was success. Men, too, participated in this judgment, though their involvement was often indirect. Approval or disinterest communicated value. Praise reinforced compliance. Silence carried its own message. A woman's appearance was taken as a reflection of her worth, her discipline, her suitability for admiration or alliance. The burden of this gaze was cumulative. Each appearance built upon the last. Reputation hardened slowly, shaped by consistency. A single misstep could disrupt it. A pattern of perfection sustained it. This pressure encouraged vigilance bordering on obsession. No detail was too small to matter. Judgment extended beyond aesthetics into assumptions of character. A woman who looked unwell was assumed to be fragile. One who appeared overly adorned risked being seen as excessive. Balance was essential and elusive. The correct presentation suggested moderation, taste, and moral steadiness. Anything else invited interpretation. What made this system particularly insidious was its denial. No one claimed to judge. Politeness forbade such admission, yet the consequences were real. Social mobility stalled, marital prospects shifted, influence waned, all without a word spoken aloud. This silence reinforced compliance. Without open accusation, there could be no defense. The only recourse was prevention. Control the appearance, and judgment could be minimized. The ritual of preparation thus became not indulgence, but armor. Over time, the gaze was internalized. Women learned to see themselves as others did, evaluating their own reflection with borrowed eyes. Self-surveillance replaced external enforcement. The judgment continued even in solitude. In this way, visibility became a constant negotiation. To be seen was unavoidable. To be judged was certain. And so, every effort was made to ensure that what was seen would invite as little scrutiny as possible. The mirror was never neutral. In the Gilded Age, it did not exist to admire, but to instruct. Its surface offered neither comfort nor cruelty on its own. It reflected only what society demanded to be corrected. To stand before it was to submit to a quiet lesson, repeated daily until the body learned what was expected of it. Mirrors occupied deliberate positions within private rooms. They were tall enough to capture posture, close enough to reveal detail. Their placement ensured that the body could not be viewed in fragments. One saw not just a face, but a composition: head, shoulders, waist, hands, arranged as they would be presented to the world. The mirror demanded coherence. Any discord was immediately visible. From an early age, women learned how to read these reflections. The mirror did not simply show redness, it indicated excess. It did not merely reflect shadows, it suggested fatigue, neglect, or improper management. Each flaw carried an implied cause, and each cause demanded correction. Over time, interpretation became instinctive. The body learned to anticipate judgment before it occurred. Instruction was subtle but relentless. A slightly uneven complexion prompted powder. A faint crease at the brow called for smoothing cream. A drooping posture demanded adjustment. The mirror never explained why these corrections were necessary. It assumed agreement. Its authority was borrowed from the social order beyond the glass. What made the mirror particularly effective was repetition. No single glance carried great weight, but the accumulation did. Day after day, the same face was evaluated, altered, and released. Small changes were tracked obsessively. Improvement brought relief. Decline triggered urgency. The body became a project measured in increments so small they felt manageable, until they were not. Unlike public judgment, the mirror offered no ambiguity. It did not soften criticism with politeness. It showed precisely what would be seen, stripped of excuse. This honesty gave it power. To argue with it felt futile. The reflection seemed final, even when it was temporary or misleading. Products promised partnership with the mirror. Creams, powders, tonics, each claimed to address what the glass revealed. The ritual created a closed loop. The mirror identified a problem, the product offered a solution, and the mirror then confirmed improvement. This cycle reinforced trust, even when the underlying issue persisted or worsened. Over time, the mirror's instruction extended beyond appearance into behavior. Expressions were rehearsed, smiles practiced until they appeared effortless. The face learned which emotions were permitted and which were best suppressed. Surprise softened. Distress was smoothed away. The mirror taught restraint as effectively as any governess. Yet this instruction came at a cost. The body's natural signals, heat, tension, fatigue, were reinterpreted as errors. Sensation became suspect. The mirror rewarded suppression, not awareness. Pain that did not show was considered manageable. Discomfort that appeared was treated as failure. As the years passed, the mirror's lessons became internal. Even without its presence, the body adjusted itself automatically. Posture corrected mid-step, expression moderated mid-thought. The reflection had been memorized. Thus, the mirror ceased to be an object and became a discipline. It shaped not only how women appeared, but how they perceived themselves, always in relation to expectation, never in isolation. And once its lessons were learned, they were difficult to unlearn. Marriage, in the Gilded Age, was rarely spoken of as transaction, yet it was negotiated with the precision of one. Affection might be hoped for, even expected, but suitability was assessed first. Beauty played a central role in this assessment, not as ornament, but as evidence. Well-maintained appearance suggested discipline, health, and the capacity to fulfill expectations that extended far beyond the drawing room. The face, the figure, the manner of presentation all functioned as signals. They implied how a woman would age, how she might bear children, how reliably she could represent a household in public. These assumptions were rarely stated aloud, but they guided decisions quietly. A woman who appeared composed and carefully maintained was considered a safer investment than one whose appearance hinted at strain or unpredictability. This logic shaped the urgency surrounding beauty rituals. Preparation was no longer about a single evening's impression. It was about cumulative proof. Each appearance contributed to a broader narrative. Consistency mattered. A woman who looked refined one season and unwell the next invited concern. Stability, rendered visually, reassured families seeking alliances. Mothers understood this instinctively. They watched their daughters with a particular attentiveness, noting how they were received, how their appearance was discussed, if it was discussed at all. Silence could be as telling as praise. Adjustments were made quietly. A different powder, a new regimen, altered routines meant to preserve vitality and calm. These interventions were framed as care, though their purpose was strategic. Suitors, too, evaluated appearance with practiced subtlety. Compliments were measured. Interest was expressed indirectly. A woman's beauty was rarely discussed as desire. It was framed as suitability. Words like healthy, delicate, and well-bred carried layered meanings. Each implied approval without excess. The pressure intensified as opportunities narrowed. Youth was prized not for its own sake, but for its promise. Signs of fatigue or decline carried disproportionate weight. A woman who appeared older than her years risked being perceived as already diminished. Beauty rituals thus took on a preventative role, aimed at delaying not age itself, but its recognition. Medical reassurance played a role in sustaining these efforts. Products were marketed as preserving vitality, supporting the Constitution, ensuring readiness for the demands of marriage and motherhood. The language was careful, cloaked in care rather than ambition. Beauty was aligned with duty. Maintenance became responsibility. What made this system particularly effective was its inevitability. Opting out was rarely viable. A woman who rejected these rituals did not simply reject vanity. She risked reducing her prospects. Independence was limited. Security depended on alliance. Beauty became one of the few currencies available, and it had to be spent wisely. Yet this currency depreciated quickly. The very efforts used to secure advantage could undermine long-term health. Strain accumulated quietly. The body absorbed the cost while the appearance held until it no longer could. By then, alliances were often already settled. The consequences belonged to the individual, not the system. Thus, beauty and marriage became entwined in a delicate negotiation. Appearance promised stability, refinement, and continuity. The rituals endured because they worked, at least long enough. And in a world where futures were arranged through glances and impressions, that was often considered sufficient. Admiration was never free. In the Gilded Age, it arrived with expectations attached, subtle and unspoken, yet firmly enforced. To be admired was to be watched more closely, held to higher standards, and forgiven far less. Praise elevated, but it also narrowed the margin for error. The admired woman lived under a brighter light, one that revealed deviation as quickly as it rewarded compliance. At first, admiration felt like confirmation. A glance held a moment longer. A compliment, carefully phrased, suggested success. Approval circulated quietly through rooms, conveyed in tone rather than declaration. These signals reassured. They confirmed that the rituals had worked, that the powders, the restraint, the stillness had achieved their purpose, but admiration was not passive. Once granted, it demanded maintenance. A woman known for her beauty was expected to remain beautiful. Decline, however natural, was treated as failure. What had once been praised as refinement could quickly be reinterpreted as neglect. The body, having earned attention, was no longer permitted to relax. This expectation shaped behavior with increasing intensity. The admired woman learned to anticipate disappointment before it occurred. She adjusted her routines not to improve, but to preserve. Change became dangerous. Experimentation carried risk. Consistency was safest, even if it required greater effort over time. The body absorbed this pressure quietly. Products were applied more carefully, more frequently. New remedies were introduced with cautious hope. Each promised to sustain what admiration had elevated. Doubt was rarely acknowledged. The alternative, to admit vulnerability, threatened the very status admiration conferred. Social interactions reinforced this imbalance. Admiration created distance as well as desire. Other women measured themselves against it. Comparisons formed silently. Resentment, when it surfaced, did so indirectly. The admired woman was expected to remain gracious, unaffected, composed. Any sign of strain undermined the image she was meant to uphold. Men, too, contributed to this pressure. Admiration often froze a woman in time, fixing her value to a particular appearance. Change was noticed immediately. Aging, weight fluctuation, visible fatigue, all were read as losses rather than transitions. The admired woman was loved for what she represented, not for what she endured to maintain it. Medical reassurance became increasingly important. As effort intensified, so did discomfort. Headaches, faintness, irritation, these were framed as minor inconveniences, the price of refinement. Remedies addressed symptoms without questioning cause. The goal remained preservation, not relief. Over time, admiration transformed into obligation. The woman admired for her composure learned that composure must never fail. The one praised for her pallor learned that color must never return. The one admired for stillness learned that movement itself risked disappointment. The qualities that drew approval became constraints. What made this exchange particularly cruel was its silence. No one demanded perfection aloud. The admired woman was simply expected to know, and she did. The rules had been learned early, reinforced daily, and confirmed by reward. Thus, admiration revealed its true cost. It offered recognition in exchange for vigilance, approval in exchange for endurance. And once accepted, it could not be relinquished easily. To step out of admiration was to risk invisibility, or worse, scrutiny stripped of kindness. So the rituals continued. The mirror approved, the room responded. Admiration endured, purchased daily at a price rarely acknowledged, but always paid. The powder was never questioned. It sat in its porcelain dish with quiet authority, pale and finely milled, carrying a faint scent that few could name and fewer wished to consider. Rosewater softened it, lavender masked it, but beneath the perfume lingered something sharper, an edge that caught at the back of the throat if one breathed too deeply. This was dismissed as potency. Effective things, it was understood, were rarely gentle. Application followed habit rather than thought. A soft puff pressed lightly against the skin, moving in practiced arcs across cheeks, brow, and chin. The goal was evenness, not coverage. The powder did not exist to be seen. It existed to correct, to cool the skin, to quiet color, to leave behind a surface that suggested restraint. When done well, the face appeared calm, untouched by effort or heat. The scent was part of the reassurance. It signaled seriousness, purpose. Unlike perfumes meant to delight, this smell implied function. Many powders shared it, regardless of brand. It was associated with refinement, with medical approval, with progress. Women learned to associate that faint metallic note with safety rather than warning. Manufacturers spoke confidently of purity and balance. Advertisements promised a complexion improved without excess, whitened without harm. The language was precise, almost clinical. Terms like refining, stabilizing, and corrective appeared frequently. There was no suggestion of risk, only benefit measured in subtlety. Doctors rarely objected. Some even endorsed particular preparations, lending them authority that felt unquestionable. If discomfort followed use, it was attributed to sensitivity, improper application, or the body's resistance to change. The solution was adjustment, not cessation. Less powder, perhaps. Different brand. The ritual itself remained intact. The powder's effects were immediate and visible. Redness dulled, shine disappeared. The skin took on the desired stillness, as though it had been persuaded rather than altered. This immediate success reinforced trust. Long-term considerations were distant, abstract, easily postponed. Over time, the ritual intensified. Daily application became twice daily. Touch-ups were added discreetly between engagements. The powder's presence became constant, a thin barrier between the body and the world. The skin beneath adapted, growing more dependent, more reactive without its cover. This dependency was rarely acknowledged. It felt like necessity rather than consequence. Occasional irritation was expected. A slight tingling suggested activity. Dryness implied effectiveness. These sensations were framed as temporary, even desirable, proof that the product was working. The metallic scent, once faint, grew familiar enough to fade from notice. It became part of the background, as unremarkable as the mirror itself. What few considered was accumulation. The powder did not vanish at night. It settled into pores, mixed with sweat and oil, remained despite washing. Day after day, the skin absorbed what it could not repel. Changes occurred slowly, too slowly to provoke alarm. A patch of discoloration here, increased sensitivity there. Each symptom appeared manageable in isolation. When discomfort intensified, new remedies were introduced to counter it. Soothing creams, cooling waters, tonics to restore balance. These were applied atop the powder, never instead of it. The system corrected its own damage without questioning its source. Thus the powder endured, trusted, habitual, indispensable. Its scent remained faintly metallic, its presence quietly constant. It delivered the appearance demanded of it, and that was enough. The cost, absorbed gradually by the body, remained unseen for years, hidden beneath a surface that still looked correct. Trust, once given, rarely withdrew itself easily. In the Gilded Age, it was extended generously, to doctors, to manufacturers, to the elegant labels printed in restrained fonts and softened colors. The contents of a jar mattered less than the confidence with which it was presented. A substance that arrived neatly packaged, accompanied by reassurance, was assumed to be safe by virtue of its refinement. Lead and mercury were not spoken of as dangers. They were spoken of as ingredients. Their names appeared in the language of chemistry, not caution. To the educated classes, these substances suggested progress rather than threat. They belonged to laboratories and apothecaries, to men of learning and coats kept scrupulously clean. The idea that such materials could harm when applied carefully felt improbable, almost insulting. Lead, in particular, carried an old authority. It had been used for centuries, its whitening properties well known and widely admired. It delivered results no other substance could match. Skin treated with lead preparations took on a smooth, even pallor that resisted heat and time. The effect was reliable. Reliability bred loyalty. Mercury followed a similar path. It was described as purifying, corrective, capable of clearing imperfections that resisted gentler methods. It was framed as medicine rather than cosmetic, its strength rebranded as virtue. Used sparingly, it was said to regulate rather than disrupt. Such assurances were repeated often enough to feel factual. What mattered most was endorsement. When doctors spoke favorably of these substances, hesitation dissolved. Medical authority carried immense weight, particularly when it aligned with social expectation. A physician who cautioned against use risked being seen as old-fashioned or alarmist. Progress demanded confidence, not doubt. Discomfort was addressed selectively. Irritation was acknowledged. Weakness was noted. But cause and effect were rarely connected directly. Symptoms were attributed to nerves, constitution, or improper application. Remedies focused on mitigation rather than prevention. The substances themselves remained unquestioned. This trust was reinforced by gradual exposure. The body did not react dramatically at first. Effects accumulated slowly, their progression subtle enough to escape alarm. Skin that thinned or discolored did so incrementally. Fatigue crept in over years, not days. The absence of immediate catastrophe reassured users that their faith was justified. Social reinforcement strengthened this belief. Everyone used similar products. Shared routines normalized sensation. If irritation was common, it was assumed to be harmless. Comparison replaced investigation. Individual experience was measured against collective behavior, and collective behavior suggested safety. Manufacturers capitalized on this trust carefully. Labels emphasized balance, moderation, refinement. Instructions advised restraint, while promising improvement. The tone was paternal, calm, authoritative. There was no need for warning when confidence sufficed. Over time, trust became habit and habit became dependence. To abandon a trusted preparation felt risky, even irresponsible. What if alternatives failed? What if withdrawal worsened appearance? The known discomfort felt safer than unknown consequences. Thus, lead and mercury persisted not through ignorance, but through belief. They were integrated into routines that promised control in a world obsessed with presentation. The substances delivered what they claimed, at least for a while. And as long as the mirror reflected success, trust remained intact. Only later, when damage became undeniable, did doubt surface. But by then, the rituals were deeply embedded, and trust, once given, had already exacted its price. Color, when permitted, had to be earned. In the Gilded Age, rouge was not applied casually, nor was it meant to announce itself. It existed to suggest vitality without excess, warmth without abandon. The correct flush implied health, not excitement, life, not appetite. Achieving this balance required substances that did more than stain the skin. They acted upon it. Rouge that merely colored was considered inadequate. The most trusted preparations worked by irritation, by coaxing blood to the surface, by provoking warmth where restraint had dulled it. A faint sting was expected. A subtle heat confirmed effectiveness. Women learned to associate discomfort with authenticity. If the cheeks tingled, the rouge was doing its work. Application was careful and deliberate. Too much pressure produced obvious color. Too little failed to activate the skin. Fingers were used rather than brushes, the warmth of the hand assisting the process. The burn rose gradually, spreading beneath the surface until the desired bloom appeared. Timing mattered. The effect had to settle before the mirror approved. Sensation was framed as temporary, even invigorating. Advertisements spoke of awakening the complexion, of stimulating natural beauty. Pain was not named. Instead, it was softened into language of renewal. A brief discomfort promised hours of composure. The exchange seemed reasonable. Medical authority rarely objected. Some physicians even praised these preparations for encouraging circulation, aligning cosmetic practice with health. The idea that irritation might be harmful felt counterintuitive. The visible result, rosy cheeks, alert appearance, suggested benefit rather than risk. Over time, tolerance developed. What once produced sufficient color no longer did. Stronger preparations were introduced. Application became more frequent. The skin, repeatedly provoked, grew sensitive yet dependent. Without rouge, it appeared dull, drained, inadequate. The solution was never rest, only more correction. The burn became familiar, even reassuring. Its absence prompted concern. A rouge that did not sting was suspected of weakness. Effectiveness was measured by sensation rather than outcome. This logic reinforced escalation, each step justified by the last. Occasional damage was noted but minimized. Dry patches, peeling, tenderness, these were treated as inconveniences, signs that adjustment was needed. New creams were layered on to soothe the irritation caused by the rouge, never to replace it. The system sustained itself through compensation rather than reconsideration. Social reinforcement played its part. A woman whose cheeks appeared naturally flushed was admired. The cause remained invisible. Compliments reinforced the practice, confirming that the discomfort had paid off. The mirror, once again, approved. Yet beneath the surface, the skin endured repeated assault. Capillaries weakened. Sensitivity increased. The line between stimulation and injury blurred. Still, the ritual continued, upheld by habit and expectation. Rouge made to burn promised life, where restraint had drained it away. It delivered color at a cost that unfolded slowly, quietly, beneath a surface praised for its calm vitality. Creams were spoken of with reverence, as though they belonged to a gentler category than powders and rouges. They arrived in heavier jars, their lids sealed with care, their textures smooth and promising. Where powders corrected and rouges provoked, creams claimed to restore. They spoke the language of alchemy, of renewal, balance, and the quiet reversal of time. The skin, it was believed, could be persuaded. Treated correctly, it would soften, tighten, brighten, and smooth itself into obedience. Creams offered this persuasion in its most elegant form. They did not burn openly or dull color immediately. They worked slowly, insinuating themselves beneath the surface, promising improvement that would appear natural rather than applied. Application became an intimate ritual. Fingers warmed the substance before it touched the face. Movements followed, prescribed paths, upward along the jaw, outward across the cheeks, carefully around the eyes. The direction mattered. Downward strokes were discouraged, thought to encourage sagging and surrender. The skin was to be lifted, guided, reminded of its proper place. Manufacturers spoke confidently of nourishment. The skin, they claimed, required feeding, just as the body did. Oils, waxes, extracts from plants both familiar and exotic were blended into formulas whose exact contents were rarely questioned. The language of care replaced that of correction. Creams were not meant to hide flaws, but to prevent them from forming at all. This promise made them particularly seductive. A woman could believe she was tending to herself rather than altering herself. The ritual felt restorative, even indulgent. It took place in quiet moments, often at night, when the face was free from scrutiny. The cream was absorbed while the body rested, working invisibly, patiently. Medical reassurance supported this belief. Doctors spoke of skin as a barrier that required maintenance. Dryness was framed as vulnerability. Sensitivity suggested imbalance. Creams promised protection. Their use felt prudent, even responsible. To neglect the skin was to invite deterioration. Over time, these preparations grew more ambitious. They claimed to erase lines, tighten pores, restore elasticity. Time itself became the adversary, and creams positioned themselves as its counterforce. The idea that aging might be resisted, managed at least, was irresistible in a society that valued youth as evidence of vitality and control. Yet the effects were uneven. Some areas softened, others reacted. Irritation, breakouts, discoloration appeared unpredictably. These responses were rarely blamed on the creams themselves. Instead, the skin was said to be adjusting, purging, revealing deeper issues. Patience was advised. Consistency promised eventual harmony. Thus, application continued. Even as discomfort surfaced, new products were layered on to address reactions caused by the old. Soothing balms calmed irritation. Corrective serums targeted stubborn flaws. Each addition reinforced the belief that the solution lay in further refinement rather than restraint. The alchemy was convincing because it unfolded slowly. Improvement appeared gradual, plausible. Decline, when it came, could be attributed to age, stress, or temperament rather than the treatments themselves. The creams remained allies, not suspects. In this way, the skin became a site of ongoing negotiation. Creams promised mastery over time and texture, over softness and firmness. They delivered just enough improvement to sustain belief, while quietly entangling the body in ever-deepening dependence. The ritual endured, guided by faith in transformation that was always just one application away. Approval, when it came from a man in a clean coat and measured voice, carried the weight of finality. In the Gilded Age, doctors occupied a position of near unquestioned authority, their confidence mistaken for certainty, their composure interpreted as mastery. When they spoke of beauty preparations, they did so not as indulgences, but as sensible adjuncts to health, tools to maintain balance in bodies considered naturally fragile. Many physicians saw no contradiction in this alignment. Skin was an organ, they reasoned. Organs required care. If creams softened irritation, if powders cooled excessive color, if tonics restored what appeared diminished, then their use was not vanity, but prudence. Beauty and health overlapped conveniently, their boundaries blurred by language that emphasized regulation rather than alteration. Consultations rarely addressed ingredients directly. Instead, they focused on results. A patient described redness, fatigue, or dullness. The doctor observed, nodded, and suggested refinement. The cause was framed broadly: nerves, circulation, temperament. Solutions followed the same logic. A particular powder might calm the skin. A cream could protect it. A preparation containing mercury or lead was mentioned only insofar as it had proven effective elsewhere. This approach reassured. It shifted responsibility away from the substances themselves and onto the individual body. If irritation occurred, The body was sensitive. If fatigue worsened, the constitution was delicate. The remedy was adjustment, not abandonment. Trust in the physician ensured compliance. Doctors were not malicious. Many genuinely believed in progress, in the promise of chemistry to refine and improve. The dangers of long-term exposure were poorly understood, and immediate results were compelling. When a preparation visibly improved a patient's appearance, it was taken as evidence of benefit. Decline, when it arrived, came too slowly to challenge this belief. Professional distance reinforced authority. Physicians did not share the daily rituals of application. They did not sit under gaslight, pressing powders into their own skin. Their relationship to these substances was theoretical, observational. This separation allowed confidence to persist unchecked. Women rarely questioned such approval. To do so would have required challenging not only medical authority, but the social structures it supported. Beauty was expected. Doctors provided reassurance that meeting this expectation was safe, even responsible. Doubt, when it surfaced, felt misplaced. Occasionally, a physician expressed caution. Such voices were often dismissed as conservative or outdated. Progress favored certainty. Patients gravitated toward doctors whose advice aligned with their needs rather than their fears. Approval became selective, sought where it would be granted. Over time, medical endorsement normalized risk. Preparations moved seamlessly from apothecaries to dressing tables, their presence legitimized by authority. The rituals continued, now fortified by professional sanction. In this way, doctors became quiet collaborators in the maintenance of appearance. Their approval transformed cosmetics into care, ritual into treatment. And once framed as medicine, these practices resisted scrutiny, shielded by trust that would take decades to erode. The labels were reassuring in their restraint. Printed in muted tones, bordered with delicate lines, they spoke softly of balance, purity, and refinement. There were no sharp words, no cautions set apart in heavier ink. Nothing suggested danger. In their place were promises, measured, calm, and confident, that implied safety through elegance alone. Ingredients, when listed at all, appeared in language few questioned and fewer fully understood. Latin names lent authority. Chemical terms suggested precision. To the untrained eye, this complexity felt like protection rather than obscurity. What was difficult to read seemed unlikely to be careless. The absence of warning was interpreted as assurance. Manufacturers relied on this logic carefully. Their labels did not deceive outright, they simply omitted. There was no space for uncertainty on porcelain jars meant for the dressing table. Doubt did not suit the aesthetic. A product that required caution would have disrupted the ritual, forcing thought where ease was expected. Women learned to trust the presentation. The jar felt substantial in the hand. The lid closed with certainty. The scent was familiar, softened by florals that implied gentleness. These sensory cues replaced information. They told the user everything she felt she needed to know. Medical language further blurred boundaries. Words like corrective, balancing, and purifying appeared frequently, borrowing the authority of treatment without its accountability. These terms suggested intervention without consequence, improvement without risk. The skin was framed as something that needed management, not protection. The absence of warnings shaped behavior subtly. Without explicit limits, application increased naturally. More powder ensured calm. Additional cream promised protection. Reapplication felt prudent rather than excessive. The body's responses, tingling, dryness, fatigue, were interpreted as signals to refine technique, not to reconsider use. This lack of caution also discouraged comparison. Without guidance, women relied on observation of one another. If a friend used the same preparation without apparent harm, it reinforced belief. Collective behavior replaced instruction. Safety became communal assumption rather than informed choice. Manufacturers benefited from this silence. Responsibility remained diffuse. If harm occurred, it appeared personal, idiosyncratic. Without warnings, there could be no clear violation. The system protected itself through ambiguity. Over time, this omission normalized exposure. Substances that might have raised concern if explained plainly became routine through repetition. The body adapted until it could not, and by then the source of trouble was deeply embedded in daily life. Thus, the labels remained quiet. Their elegance concealed omission. Their restraint encouraged trust, and the absence of warning became one of the most powerful assurances of all. Distance lent authority. In the Gilded Age, a substance that arrived from elsewhere, across oceans through ports wrapped in unfamiliar names, carried an automatic prestige. Imported beauty preparations were assumed to be superior by virtue of their journey. What was rare was valuable. What was foreign was refined. Manufacturers understood this instinct well. Labels boasted of origins that sounded both distant and deliberate. Alpine springs, Mediterranean herbs, Eastern resins. Even when these references were vague, they conjured landscapes untouched by industrial grime, places imagined as purer, older, wiser. The suggestion alone was enough. Few questioned how such ingredients were sourced, processed, or preserved by the time they reached the dressing table. These imports promised something domestic preparations could not: mystery. Their effectiveness was attributed not only to chemistry, but to geography. A cream from France implied sophistication. A powder associated with the East suggested ancient knowledge. The unfamiliar protected the product from scrutiny. What was not fully understood was less likely to be challenged. Women spoke of these preparations with quiet pride. To possess them signaled access, connections, taste, discernment. The rituals surrounding their use grew more careful, almost reverent. Application felt less like routine and more like participation in something elevated. Discomfort, when it occurred, was framed as potency. Strong things, it was reasoned, came from far away. Medical endorsement followed cautiously but consistently. Doctors rarely dismissed imported remedies outright. Many spoke favorably of continental advancements, reinforcing the belief that progress arrived from elsewhere. A preparation praised abroad was assumed to be safe at home. National pride yielded easily to perceived sophistication. This deference obscured risk. Ingredients unfamiliar to local practitioners escaped scrutiny simply because they were unfamiliar. Without a shared history of use, there was little context for concern. Reactions were treated as individual sensitivities rather than warnings. The preparation itself remained untarnished by doubt. Over time, imported beauty became integrated into daily life. What began as novelty turned habitual. The foreign lost its strangeness without losing its authority. Products were replenished automatically, their use unquestioned. Thus, distance continued to protect danger. What came from afar was trusted to know better, and in this belief, the body absorbed substances whose origins felt safer, precisely because they were unknown. Routine offered reassurance where knowledge failed. In the Gilded Age, repetition was mistaken for safety, its predictability soothing doubts that never quite formed. What was done daily felt correct by virtue of its endurance. A ritual repeated without immediate consequence became indistinguishable from necessity. Morning and evening followed the same quiet sequence. The wash, the powder, the cream, the careful inspection beneath forgiving light. Each step flowed into the next with practiced ease. There was comfort in not having to decide anew. The body moved through the motions almost without instruction, guided by habit rather than thought. This regularity masked escalation. Products were added slowly, one at a time, folded into the routine so gently they barely registered as changes. A new cream to address irritation caused by the old. A stronger powder to maintain pallor no longer achieved by the familiar brand. Each addition was justified as refinement, not increase. The routine absorbed these changes seamlessly. What mattered was continuity. As long as the ritual remained intact, it felt controlled. Disruption, not accumulation, was what provoked unease. To skip a step invited anxiety. The face looked wrong. The body felt exposed. Routine thus became both shield and restraint. Medical reassurance supported this dependence. Doctors encouraged consistency, framing it as discipline rather than risk. Irregular use, they warned, could confuse the system. The body preferred stability. Such advice reinforced repetition, even when symptoms suggested reconsideration. Social reinforcement deepened the comfort. Friends compared routines with familiarity rather than concern. Shared habits created solidarity. If everyone followed similar regimens, they could not all be wrong. Collective practice replaced evidence. The routine belonged not to the individual, but to the class. Over time, the ritual grew heavier without feeling burdensome. What once took minutes expanded quietly. More steps promised more control. The mirror approved just enough to sustain belief. Discomfort, when it appeared, was interpreted as proof of necessity. Without the routine, things would surely be worse. Thus, routine dulled alarm. It transformed exposure into normalcy, accumulation into habit. The body adjusted until it could not, and even then the ritual persisted, because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. No one announced when the experiment began. There were no notes taken, no controls established, no clear hypothesis declared. And yet, across dressing tables and private rooms, bodies were being tested daily, altered, observed, adjusted, and altered again. Beauty, in practice, became a quiet experiment conducted without consent, guided by results rather than understanding. Each product introduced a variable. A new powder promised finer pallor. A cream claimed deeper nourishment. A tonic suggested internal correction for external flaws. These were added incrementally, their effects watched with careful attention. Improvement was noted with relief. Decline prompted intervention. The body's responses were tracked not with instruments, but with mirrors and whispered comparison. What distinguished this experiment from those conducted in laboratories was its intimacy. The subject and the observer were the same. Sensation was felt directly, then interpreted through expectation. A tingling face suggested action. A tightening sensation implied benefit. Pain, when mild, was reframed as progress. Discomfort was data, but only insofar as it could be made to fit the desired conclusion. There was no baseline for health. The body as it naturally existed was never considered sufficient for comparison. Improvement was measured against an ideal that shifted constantly, shaped by fashion, admiration, and anxiety. The experiment could never conclude because its goal was never fixed. Manufacturers encouraged this mindset subtly. Products were described as advancements, improvements, new discoveries. Each implied that what came before was incomplete. To remain static was to fall behind. Curiosity, framed as sophistication, drove adoption. A woman who refused novelty risked appearing outdated, not merely unfashionable, but careless. Medical endorsement blurred boundaries further. Doctors spoke of trial and adjustment, of finding what suited an individual constitution. This language mirrored experimentation while avoiding its rigor. If one preparation caused irritation, another was suggested. If fatigue increased, dosage was altered. The underlying practice remained unquestioned. Over time, bodies bore the marks of cumulative testing. Skin grew reactive, alternating between resilience and collapse. Sensitivities emerged where none had existed, yet these outcomes were interpreted narrowly, as personal quirks rather than systemic consequences. The experiment continued because its failures were individualized. What made this process especially enduring was hope. Each new product promised resolution. The next cream might restore balance, the next powder might correct what the last disrupted. Optimism sustained participation long after caution might have intervened. Thus, beauty became iterative. The body was adjusted, assessed, and adjusted again. Results were never final, only provisional. And in this endless cycle, the experiment expanded, unrecorded, uncontrolled, and deeply personal, leaving its findings written slowly into skin, nerves, and bone. The body spoke first in whispers, a dryness that lingered longer than expected, a fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to correct, a faint trembling in the hands dismissed as nerves. These signs arrived gradually, without drama, easy to ignore when measured against the demands of appearance. And when they were noticed, they were rarely believed. Symptoms were inconvenient. They disrupted the narrative of control that beauty rituals promised. To acknowledge them fully would have required reconsideration of products trusted, of routines refined over years, of authority already granted. It was far simpler to explain them away. Language provided the means. Irritation became sensitivity. Weakness was framed as delicacy. Headaches were attributed to temperament, weather, or social exertion. The body's protests were softened into personality traits rather than warnings. This reframing allowed routines to continue uninterrupted. Medical consultation often reinforced this dismissal. Doctors spoke of nerves strained by modern life, of constitutions overwhelmed by stimulation. Remedies were prescribed to calm rather than to remove cause. Tonics strengthened, sedatives soothed, ointments relieved surface discomfort. None required abandoning the practices that provoked the symptoms in the first place. This approach felt compassionate. It avoided accusation. The body was treated as body. Temporarily overwhelmed, not endangered. The products remained allies, the body, the problem. Responsibility shifted inward. If symptoms persisted, it was because the individual had failed to adapt. Social comparison deepened this belief. Others reported similar discomforts, discussed casually in drawing rooms. Such shared experience normalized suffering. If everyone felt this way, it could not be dangerous. Collective endurance replaced inquiry. Over time, symptoms layered themselves. Minor issues overlapped, creating a background of unease that became familiar. The body adjusted its expectations downward. What once would have provoked alarm became tolerable. The threshold for concern shifted steadily. This gradual accommodation was crucial. Acute pain demands response. Chronic discomfort invites management. Beauty rituals thrived in this latter space, where harm unfolded slowly enough to be negotiated away. Thus, symptoms were absorbed into daily life, explained by nerves, weather, age, or mood. The true cause remained untouched, protected by trust, habit, and the persistent belief that refinement could not possibly be dangerous. The corset was never described as clothing. It was described as support, an instrument of posture, of discipline, of refinement. In the language of the Gilded Age, it was corrective rather than restrictive, an architectural solution to a body assumed to be unfinished on its own. To lace a corset was to reshape space. The waist narrowed, the chest lifted, the back straightened into a line that suggested composure even before the face was prepared. This transformation was immediate and visible, which lent it authority. What produced such instant improvement could not easily be questioned. Women were introduced to corsetry gradually, as though acclimation were kindness. Early stays were lighter, their pressure presented as guidance rather than force. Over time, the structure grew firmer, the body adapted, learning. New limits without protest. Breathing adjusted, muscles yielded. What once felt constricting became familiar. The corset imposed order from the outside inward. It dictated how one sat, how one stood, how one moved through space. Sudden gestures were discouraged by design. Stillness became easier when motion was physically limited. In this way, the corset reinforced the discipline already expected of the body. Medical justification supported its use. Doctors spoke of spinal support, of improved posture, of organs held in proper alignment. Discomfort was framed as adjustment rather than injury. The body, it was said, required guidance to maintain health. The corset provided that guidance efficiently. Fashion reinforced the structure's authority. Silhouettes demanded narrow waists and lifted lines. Dresses were cut to accommodate the corset's shape, not the body's. To remove it was to risk collapse, not merely physical, but social. The corset became inseparable from appearance itself. Over time, the body changed. Muscles weakened where support was constant. Organs shifted subtly, adapting to the pressure imposed upon them. These changes were gradual, unfolding quietly beneath layers of fabric. Symptoms, shortness of breath, faintness, digestive discomfort, were noted but rarely connected back to the structure that caused them. Servants assisted with lacing, their skill ensuring symmetry and firmness. Tightness was adjusted carefully, negotiated rather than forced. This collaboration softened responsibility. The corset did not oppress, it was applied. Choice appeared to exist, even when expectation made it illusory. What made the corset particularly enduring was its promise of improvement. It delivered control instantly, visibly. Without it, the body felt unfamiliar, uncontained. The mirror reflected disorder. The solution was always the same: lace again. Thus, the corset functioned as architecture, external scaffolding that shaped the body into socially acceptable form. It created elegance through constraint and transformed restraint into virtue. And once built into daily life, its presence felt indispensable, even as it quietly redefined what the body could endure. Breathing, once instinctive, became deliberate. Within the architecture of the corset, the body learned new rhythms, shallower, quieter, constrained by design. The lungs adjusted not because they wished to, but because there was no alternative. Air entered in measured amounts, sufficient to sustain, never enough to expand fully. This restraint was praised as composure. The change was gradual. At first, there was awareness, a tightness at the ribs, a subtle resistance when drawing breath. This was framed as posture correcting itself, the body aligning with expectation. Over time, the sensation faded, replaced by familiarity. What had once felt restrictive became normal. The body learned to breathe within limits it did not choose. Speech adapted. Alongside, breath. Sentences shortened. Laughter softened. Conversation grew measured, its cadence shaped by available air. Excitement was tempered not by will alone, but by capacity. This lent an air of calm that society admired. The body's constraint was interpreted as temperament. Medical explanations supported this adaptation. Doctors spoke of proper breathing, of the dangers of excess expansion. Deep breaths were associated with exertion, even vulgarity. Refined breathing was controlled breathing, evidence of discipline rather than deprivation. The corset, it was said, encouraged this refinement. Yet the consequences unfolded quietly. Reduced breath altered circulation. Lightheadedness appeared during exertion, dismissed as delicacy. Fainting was treated as an inconvenience, almost a social ritual in itself. The body's need for air was reframed as weakness rather than warning. Over time, the lungs adjusted their expectations downward. Full breaths felt unfamiliar, even uncomfortable when the corset was removed. The body resisted expansion, as though it had forgotten how. Muscles that once assisted breathing weakened, their work outsourced to structure. Night offered little reprieve. Corsets were loosened, not removed entirely. The body remained held, its breath guided even in rest. Dreams unfolded within this restraint, the subconscious learning the same limits as the waking body. This learned, breathing reinforced stillness. Sudden movement demanded air the body could not easily supply. Calm became necessity rather than choice. The admired composure of the elite thus emerged not only from training, but from physical adaptation to constraint. In time, breath itself became a discipline. The body learned to exist comfortably on less, to treat sufficiency as abundance. Society rewarded this restraint, mistaking adaptation for elegance. Thus, breathing was relearned, not as expansion, but as control. The corset taught the lungs their place, and the body complied, quietly adjusting to a world that valued containment over capacity. Measurements acquired meaning beyond their numbers. In the Gilded Age, the waist became a site of fixation, its circumference treated as evidence of discipline, virtue, and refinement. Inches were counted not merely to size garments, but to affirm belonging. A narrow waist suggested mastery, over appetite, over impulse, over the body itself. The ideal was precise yet shifting, its limits narrowing season by season. Fashion plates displayed silhouettes that appeared almost improbable, their proportions drawn rather than lived. Yet these images were not understood as exaggeration. They were taken as instruction. The body was expected to follow. Corsetry provided the means. Laces tightened incrementally, each adjustment small enough to feel reasonable. Progress was measured quietly, sometimes celebrated privately. A reduced measurement brought reassurance, even pride. It suggested success in a system that rewarded compliance above all else. What was rarely acknowledged was how unnatural these dimensions truly were. The human body was not designed for such compression. Organs shifted, Ribs bent inward, muscles adapted to reduce space. The waist that emerged was less a feature than a construction, achieved through persistence rather than anatomy. Medical discourse struggled to reconcile this reality. Some physicians warned against extremes, yet rarely challenged the practice itself. Moderation was advised without definition. What constituted excess remained conveniently vague. As long as the wearer appeared composed, concern felt unnecessary. Social reinforcement overwhelmed caution. Compliments followed reduction. Admiration lingered. Dresses fit as intended. The mirror confirmed success. These immediate rewards outweighed distant consequences. The body's discomfort, shortness of breath, digestive irregularities, fatigue, was managed rather than addressed. Servants assisted with lacing, their hands skilled in achieving symmetry. Tightness was negotiated daily, adjusted according to schedule and expectation. This collaboration diffused responsibility. The waist was not forced, it was achieved through routine. Over time, the body changed its sense of normal. A natural waist felt unfamiliar, even wrong. Without the corset structure, posture collapsed, confidence faltered. The artificially narrow waist became the reference point against which all else was judged. This transformation extended beyond clothing. Appetite was moderated to preserve shape. Meals were managed carefully. Hunger became a tool rather than a signal. The waist's measurement dictated behavior long before the mirror was consulted. In this way, waists that should not exist came into being, not through violence, but through patience. The body adapted to expectations that ignored its design. And once achieved, these proportions were defended fiercely. Their maintenance woven into daily life. The narrow waist stood as proof of discipline, proof of belonging, proof that the body had been successfully persuaded to yield. Posture was never treated as a physical habit alone. In the Gilded Age, it was read as a moral statement, a visible declaration of self-command. The way a body occupied space was believed to reveal temperament, breeding, and worth long before a word was spoken. To stand correctly was to announce reliability. To falter was to invite interpretation. From childhood, posture was corrected with quiet persistence. Shoulders were drawn back, chins lifted just enough to suggest confidence without defiance. Slouching was discouraged, not because it harmed the spine, but because it suggested carelessness. A body that collapsed inward was thought to reflect a mind doing the same. Corsetry enforced this lesson efficiently. With the torso held upright by structure, the appearance of good posture became effortless. The body learned the shape it was expected to maintain, even when the corset was absent. Muscles adapted, some strengthening through tension, others weakening through disuse. The upright stance became default, not choice. Social spaces rewarded this alignment. A woman who carried herself well was described as composed, dignified, trustworthy. Her posture lent credibility to her presence. Conversely, a woman who leaned, shifted, or curved inward risked being perceived as uncertain or unserious. These judgments were rarely articulated, but they shaped interactions all the same. Medical language reinforced this symbolism. Doctors spoke of posture as supportive of health, of organs held correctly, of circulation improved by alignment. The suggestion that uprightness equated to well-being made correction feel responsible rather than imposed. Pain that accompanied the effort was reframed as adjustment. Yet maintaining posture required constant vigilance. Muscles ached, fatigue accumulated. The body's desire to rest conflicted with the expectation to remain arranged. Chairs offered little relief, designed more for appearance than comfort. Rest, when permitted, still required form. Over time, posture became internalized as identity. To slump felt not merely uncomfortable, but wrong, almost shameful. The body resisted relaxation, holding itself in place even when alone. This tension, sustained daily, manifested quietly as stiffness, headaches, and exhaustion. Still, the upright figure persisted as ideal. It suggested resilience, stability, and virtue. Posture, like complexion and waist, became another surface on which character was displayed. The body complied, bearing the strain silently, while society praised the result. In this way, posture transcended anatomy. It became language, spoken continuously, unconsciously, and judged relentlessly. Fainting was not treated as interruption. It was accommodated, anticipated, almost ritualized. In the parlors and ballrooms of the Gilded Age, a woman's collapse rarely produced panic. Instead, it summoned practiced responses, chairs drawn close, salts uncapped, voices lowered. The body's surrender was handled with calm efficiency, as though it were an expected punctuation rather than a warning. This familiarity robbed the event of urgency. Fainting was framed as delicacy, not distress. It suggested sensitivity rather than failure, refinement rather than danger. The very conditions that produced it, tight corsetry, restricted breath, prolonged standing, were rarely questioned. They were accepted as the cost of presentation, and fainting became their visible but tolerated consequence. Women learned to recognize the approach, a narrowing of vision, a warmth rising too quickly, a sense of distance from one's own limbs. These sensations were managed quietly. One sat down if possible, one leaned discreetly. If collapse came, it was done with minimal disruption, the body yielding gracefully rather than resisting. Medical explanations reinforced this normalization. Doctors spoke of nerves overwhelmed by stimulation, of constitutions ill-suited to crowded rooms or emotional excitement. The solution was moderation, not relief. Smelling salts revived quickly, restoring composure without addressing cause. Recovery was measured in minutes, not meaning. Social response further minimized concern. Guests resumed conversation. Hosts offered apologies more for inconvenience than alarm. The fainting woman, once revived, was expected to return to participation or withdraw politely. There was no expectation of rest, no insistence on examination. The event closed itself neatly. This acceptance shaped behavior. Women adjusted routines to accommodate fainting rather than prevent it. They learned how long they could stand, how tightly they could be laced, how much exertion they could endure before the body protested. These limits were respected tactically, not challenged structurally. Over time, fainting lost its power to signal danger. It became background noise in a system that valued appearance above endurance. The body's most dramatic objection was absorbed into etiquette, rendered manageable through ritual. Yet each faint carried cost. Oxygen deprivation, repeated strain, cumulative weakness. These effects unfolded invisibly, masked by recovery that appeared swift but left residue. The body paid gradually for what society dismissed easily. Thus, fainting persisted without alarm, an accepted consequence of refinement, a quiet acknowledgement of limits that were never allowed to redefine the rules themselves. Uprightness was celebrated as virtue, yet its cost was rarely counted. To remain erect, to hold the body in the approved line of refinement, required constant exertion masked as ease. The strain was subtle, distributed across hours and days, absorbed quietly until it became indistinguishable from the body itself. Standing was never passive. The spine, constrained by corsetry, bore weight in unnatural alignment. Muscles that should have shared the work were sidelined by structure, while others labored continuously to maintain appearance. What looked effortless was, in fact, sustained effort held beneath fabric and silence. Sitting offered little reprieve. Chairs were designed to display posture rather than support it. Backs were straight, seats narrow, their purpose to preserve form rather than relieve strain. Leaning was discouraged. Relaxation risked collapse of the carefully maintained line. Even rest required vigilance. Medical discourse acknowledged discomfort without challenging cause. Aches were attributed to nerves, to sensitivity, to constitution. Remedies addressed symptoms, liniments for sore backs, tonics for weakness, while the expectation of uprightness remained untouched. The posture was never the problem. The body, it was implied, had simply failed to adapt fully. Over time, organs adjusted to the demands imposed upon them. The stomach compressed, digestion slowed, the lungs operated within reduced capacity. These changes unfolded gradually, their progression subtle enough to escape alarm. What might have seemed extraordinary if sudden became ordinary through duration. The body learned to function within this narrowed space. Appetite diminished, not by choice but by capacity. Breathing shortened, not by will but by limitation. Fatigue accumulated quietly, expressed in moments of weakness that were dismissed as temperament. Social reinforcement ensured compliance. Upright women were praised. Those who leaned or rested too visibly were corrected gently or noted quietly. The reward for endurance was approval, the penalty for deviation, scrutiny. The system favored those who could bear the strain longest, not those who questioned it. Servants assisted in maintaining this posture, adjusting clothing, tightening laces, offering support when fatigue threatened collapse. Their intervention softened responsibility, framing uprightness as collaborative rather than imposed. Yet the body remained the one to endure. Over years, the cost compounded. Chronic pain settled into muscles and joints. Circulation suffered. The body's ability to recover diminished. These consequences were rarely linked back to posture itself. Instead, they were accepted as the price of refinement, paid gradually and without acknowledgement. Thus, uprightness persisted as ideal, its cost borne privately. The body adapted until it could not, and even then the expectation remained. Appearance demanded endurance, and endurance, once normalized, ceased to be questioned. The corset was rarely fastened by its wearer alone. More often, it was secured by practiced hands belonging to someone else. Maids who knew the body's measurements better than the woman herself, who understood how much tension could be applied before breath faltered or fabric strained. Their role was technical, precise, and quietly influential. Lacing was not a casual task. It followed an unspoken protocol. The servant stood behind, drawing the cords evenly, ensuring symmetry. Too loose invited disapproval, too tight risked visible distress. The correct tension lay somewhere between, firm enough to shape, gentle enough to allow composure. This balance was learned through repetition rather than instruction. Servants were expected to know when to stop without being told. A sharp intake of breath, a subtle stiffening of posture. These cues guided their hands. Communication was minimal. The ritual relied on familiarity, not dialogue. To question tightness would have disrupted the process, introducing doubt where efficiency was prized. Responsibility for discomfort was diffused through this arrangement. The corset was not tightened by command, it was adjusted collaboratively. If pain followed, it could be attributed to necessity rather than intention. The servant had done her duty. The wearer had submitted appropriately. No one had chosen excess explicitly. Yet, expectations were clear. Fashion dictated narrow waists. Society rewarded the result. Servants understood that delivering this outcome mattered. A poorly laced corset reflected not only on the wearer, but on the household's competence. Precision was professionalism. Over time, servants learned to tighten incrementally, a fraction more each day. Progress achieved without confrontation. The body adapted gradually, reducing resistance. What might have provoked protest if done abruptly became tolerable through patience. This method was praised as skill. The servant's detachment reinforced the system. She did not inhabit the corset's consequences. Once laced, she stepped away. The discomfort belonged to someone else. This separation allowed efficiency without empathy, not through cruelty, but through role. Each participant fulfilled her part. Occasionally, a maid noticed distress, pallor deepening, breath shortening. Adjustments were made discreetly, a slight loosening, a pause. These gestures were framed as kindness, not reconsideration. The structure remained. Only its application softened temporarily. In this way, lacing became both intimate and impersonal. It required proximity, yet discouraged connection. The servant's hands shaped a body she did not own, according to standards she did not set, for outcomes she would not experience. Thus, the corset was tightened not by force, but by routine. Responsibility dissolved into roles, and the body, held firmly within its architecture, bore the result quietly. Shaped as expected, discomfort rendered invisible by collaboration that left no one fully accountable. Admiration, when offered from a distance, required little understanding. Men praised the outcome of refinement without ever touching its mechanics, their approval shaped by appearance rather than process. They saw the line of the waist, the stillness of posture, the calm composure held beneath silk, and interpreted these as natural qualities, not constructed ones. This distance preserved illusion. The admired form appeared effortless precisely because the labor behind it was hidden. Tight lacing happened elsewhere. Breath was constrained privately. Discomfort was managed out of sight. By the time admiration was offered, the work had already been done, and the result presented as fact rather than effort. Compliments reinforced this separation. Words like graceful, delicate, and refined implied inherent traits. They rewarded the surface while ignoring the strain beneath it. The more convincingly a woman concealed effort, the more praise she received. Success depended not only on endurance, but on invisibility. Men rarely questioned how such shapes were achieved. The question felt unnecessary. Fashion existed to be admired, not investigated. Curiosity about process risked discomfort, and discomfort disrupted pleasure. It was easier to accept the result as natural than to confront the means. Medical discourse occasionally filtered into conversation, but selectively. A man might express mild concern at fainting or fatigue, framing it as sensitivity rather than consequence. Such concern rarely extended to advocating change. The admired form was valued too highly to risk alteration. This dynamic created a quiet imbalance. Admiration incentivized endurance without accountability. The body bore the cost, while approval arrived without obligation. To challenge the system would have required acknowledging that the admired form caused harm, an admission few were willing to make. Over time, this separation hardened into expectation. Women learned that admiration depended on maintaining form, regardless of discomfort. Men learned to admire without asking. Each role sustained the other. The system persisted because it functioned smoothly at a distance. Thus, admiration remained, uncomplicated for those who offered it. The cost stayed hidden, absorbed privately, while praise circulated freely, untethered from responsibility, secure in its ignorance. Fashion reduced the body to outline. What mattered was not comfort, nor endurance, nor the quiet functioning of organs unseen, but the shape that appeared when fabric fell into place. The silhouette became the measure by which success was judged: a narrow waist, a lifted chest, a smooth vertical line uninterrupted by softness or collapse. Health, when it conflicted with this image, was expected to yield. The silhouette was public. It moved through rooms, caught light, appeared in photographs, lingered in memory. Health, by contrast, was private. Its failures were felt in solitude, in the quiet hours after guests had gone. This division ensured which would be prioritized. Appearance spoke loudly, discomfort whispered. Garments were designed with the silhouette in mind, not the body beneath. Dresses assumed the presence of a corset, shaping fabric around an ideal rather than accommodating reality. Without this structure, clothing failed to hang correctly. The body appeared unfinished, improper. The solution was always reinforcement, never reconsideration. Women learned to evaluate themselves from the outside inward. Mirrors confirmed whether the outline was correct. If the silhouette held, discomfort could be ignored. If it faltered, intervention was immediate. Tighten here, smooth there, adjust posture. The body's internal state mattered only insofar as it threatened the external line. Medical concerns were managed selectively. Symptoms that did not disrupt the silhouette were tolerated. Digestive discomfort could be hidden. Breathlessness might be masked by stillness. Fatigue could be softened by composure. Only issues that altered appearance, swelling, discoloration, collapse, demanded urgent response. Even then, remedies aimed to restore the outline rather than address cause. Bandages reduced swelling. Tonics revived pallor. Adjustments returned the body to acceptable form. The silhouette remained the goal. Health was negotiated around it. This prioritization shaped daily behavior. Meals were chosen to preserve shape rather than nourish. Rest was rationed to avoid softness. Movement was controlled to maintain line. The body learned to subordinate its needs to its appearance, treating discomfort as background noise. Over time, this imbalance became entrenched. The silhouette grew sharper as the body weakened. What looked refined required increasing effort to sustain. Yet the system rewarded persistence. A woman who maintained her outline despite strain was praised for her resilience, not questioned for her endurance. Thus, fashion elevated form above function, visibility above vitality. The silhouette reigned crisp and admired, while health receded into the private realm, managed quietly, compromised steadily, sacrificed without ceremony. Rest, when it came, was never complete. The body lay still, but it did not release itself. Muscles held their tension even in repose, as though the day's discipline had not ended with the loosening of garments. Sleep arrived reluctantly, fractured by shallow breath and postures learned too well to abandon. The body had been trained to endure, not to recover. Night routines mirrored those of the evening, only quieter. Corsets were loosened, rarely removed entirely. The structure remained close, a reminder of the shape the body was expected to resume by morning. The absence of full release preserved continuity. The body rested within limits, never beyond them. Beds offered limited relief. Mattresses were firm, chosen to maintain alignment rather than comfort. Pillows were arranged carefully, their purpose to support posture even in sleep. The body was never permitted to sprawl. Disorder was discouraged at every hour. Sleep, when it came, was light. The lungs, accustomed to restriction, did not easily expand. Breaths remained shallow, efficient, insufficient. Dreams unfolded in brief fragments, interrupted by discomfort that never quite surfaced into waking complaint. The body adjusted by necessity, not by choice. Morning brought no true restoration. Fatigue lingered, dull and familiar. It was managed rather than resolved. A wash of cold water revived appearance. Creams soothed tension at the surface. Tonics promised renewed strength. These preparations addressed the signs of exhaustion without granting the body the rest it required. Medical discourse normalized this state. Doctors spoke of modern life's demands, of sensitive constitutions ill-suited to idleness. Excessive rest, they warned, risked languor. Activity, even when exhausting, was considered invigorating. The solution to fatigue was not sleep, but management. Social expectation reinforced this denial. A woman who appeared too rested risked being perceived as idle. Energy had to be visible, but controlled. The ideal was not vigor, but composure, the ability to function without showing strain. Rest that erased effort was suspect. Rest that preserved appearance was acceptable. Over time, the body adapted by lowering its expectations. What once would have felt unbearable became normal. Pain settled into background sensation. Tension became baseline. The body no longer anticipated relief. It anticipated endurance. This inability to rest fully accumulated cost slowly. Immune resilience weakened. Recovery slowed. Minor ailments lingered. Yet because decline was gradual, it rarely provoked alarm. The body's complaints were diffuse, unspecific, easily attributed to temperament or age. Thus, bodies that could not rest persisted, upright, composed, functional. They met the demands placed upon them day after day, supported by routines that masked exhaustion while deepening it. The system functioned smoothly so long as the body continued to comply. And so it did, until compliance itself became the source of its quiet undoing. At first, the skin resisted quietly, a patch of dryness that lingered longer than expected, a faint irritation that returned each morning despite careful washing and generous cream. These were minor inconveniences, easily explained and easily dismissed. Skin, it was understood, was temperamental. It required patience, but patience did not restore what had begun to change. Over time, small injuries refused to resolve. A blemish faded slowly, leaving discoloration behind. Redness settled into places it had never occupied before. The surface grew thinner, more reactive, its calm increasingly difficult to maintain. What once responded predictably to routine now resisted correction. This was deeply unsettling. The rituals had always promised control. They worked because they had always worked. When the skin failed to respond, the failure was felt not as physical decline, but as disruption of order. Something dependable had become unreliable. The instinctive response was escalation. Stronger creams were introduced. Powders were reapplied more frequently to conceal unevenness. New preparations promised repair at a deeper level, speaking of renewal beneath the surface, of restoring balance long lost. The language suggested healing without questioning why healing was suddenly necessary. Doctors reassured with familiar explanations. Aging, they said, altered the skin's behavior. Nerves affected circulation. Sensitivity increased naturally with refinement. The solution lay not in retreat, but in adaptation. The regimen needed refinement, not abandonment. Thus, irritation was treated as deficiency. The skin was assumed to lack something: moisture, nourishment, stimulation. Rarely was it considered that it might be overwhelmed. The idea that restraint could heal felt counterintuitive in a culture built on correction. As healing slowed, concealment took priority. The mirror demanded evenness, regardless of the surface beneath. Powders smoothed what creams could not. Rouge distracted from discoloration. The skin was presented as composed, even as it protested beneath layers of intervention. The body learned to tolerate chronic inflammation as background sensation. Tenderness became ordinary. Tightness accompanied every movement of expression. These sensations were absorbed into routine, no longer remarkable enough to disrupt it. Yet the skin's resistance carried consequence. It broke more easily, reacted more sharply. What had once been a resilient boundary became fragile, increasingly vulnerable to the very substances meant to protect it. This fragility was met with more care, more product, more intervention. Thus, the cycle deepened. The skin would not heal because it was never allowed to rest. Its failure was managed cosmetically, framed as a challenge to be solved rather than a warning to be heeded. And so the surface remained presentable, while beneath it, repair slowed, resistance weakened, and the body learned, quietly, reluctantly, that some damage could not be polished away. Hair had always been treated as reliable. It grew steadily, predictably, responding to brushing, oils, and careful arrangement. Loss, when it occurred, was expected to follow age or illness, not to arrive abruptly in otherwise controlled lives. And yet, one morning, the brush held more than it should have. At first, it was dismissed. Seasonal shedding, it was said, a temporary response to stress or weather. Hair, like skin, was assumed to fluctuate. A few extra strands carried no meaning on their own. The body, after all, was sensitive. But the strands continued to appear, on pillows, along collars, caught in the teeth of combs meant to smooth and order. The loss was uneven, unpredictable. Some days seemed better than others, offering false reassurance. The pattern resisted explanation. The scalp grew tender. Oils that once softened now irritated. Tonics promised renewal, claiming to strengthen roots and encourage growth. Their scents were sharp, medicinal, reassuring in their seriousness. Application stung slightly, interpreted as stimulation rather than harm. The discomfort suggested activity. Activity suggested hope. Doctors spoke carefully. Hair loss, they explained, could follow nervous strain. Excessive refinement taxed the system. The solution lay in fortification. Better circulation, improved vitality. Rarely was the possibility of cumulative toxicity raised. The substances applied daily to scalp and skin were not considered suspects. Concealment followed naturally. Hairstyles adjusted to disguise thinning. Partings shifted. Volume was engineered through padding and arrangement. The goal was not restoration, but invisibility. As long as loss remained unseen, it could be endured. Social reaction intensified the pressure. Hair was associated with youth, health, and composure. Thinning carried implications far beyond aesthetics. It suggested decline, imbalance, loss of control. The fear was not vanity alone, but what such change might imply about the body's internal state. Thus, efforts increased, stronger tonics, more frequent application, treatments left on longer. Each promised to correct what the last had failed to restore. The scalp absorbed what it could, growing more sensitive with each attempt. Loss continued quietly. The body adjusted by rationing what it could spare. Growth slowed, shedding persisted. The cause remained elusive because it was never sought directly. The system preferred management to investigation. In this way, hair fell without warning, not as sudden catastrophe, but as gradual erosion. Each strand lost seemed insignificant alone. Together, they marked a threshold crossed too slowly to provoke alarm, yet too steadily to reverse. The mouth was meant to be discreet. Smiles were controlled, laughter measured, the teeth revealed only briefly, and politely. This restraint made their condition easy to overlook, until it could not be ignored. Changes arrived subtly at first, mistaken for sensitivity or momentary discomfort. A twinge when drinking something cold, a dull ache after a meal. These sensations were noted, then dismissed. Dental pain was inconvenient but rarely urgent. Teeth, like skin and hair, were expected to endure refinement without complaint. The causes of discomfort were attributed to temperament, to nerves, to the natural wear of age. Few considered the daily exposure to powders, tonics, and cosmetic waters that passed across lips and gums as part of the problem. Fashion played its role quietly. Whitening powders promised brilliance, their abrasive textures softened by perfumed reassurance. Mouth rinses claimed purity and freshness, their sharpness interpreted as cleanliness rather than corrosion. These preparations were used faithfully, their effects trusted because they aligned with the broader pursuit of refinement. Over time, enamel thinned, teeth lost their resilience, becoming vulnerable to heat and cold. The surface dulled even as efforts to brighten intensified. Discomfort increased, managed through avoidance rather than correction. Certain foods were abandoned, smiles tightened, pain became part of daily calculation. Medical and dental care lagged behind the problem. Dentistry, where available, focused on extraction rather than preservation. Softened teeth were removed once pain became intolerable, their loss accepted as unfortunate but inevitable. Prevention was rarely discussed. The practices that contributed to decay remained unquestioned. Cosmetic language obscured cause. Products promised hygiene and improvement, not harm. Their regular use felt responsible. To abandon them would have risked appearing careless, unclean. The cost to teeth was invisible until it was irreversible. Thus, fashion softened what it claimed to perfect. Teeth yielded quietly, worn down by routines. Meant to refine. The damage accumulated slowly, unnoticed until sensation forced acknowledgement. By then, the source of harm was deeply embedded in habit, its effects accepted as another private price paid for public composure. The change did not arrive as confession. It came as hesitation. Doctors who once spoke with confidence began to pause, their reassurances acquiring careful edges. The language of certainty softened into suggestion. Where approval had once been immediate, it now arrived qualified, shaped by phrases that allowed retreat if needed. Nothing was retracted outright. Authority rarely admits reversal. Instead, it adjusts. Patients noticed this shift instinctively. Consultations grew longer, less decisive. Symptoms that had once been dismissed as nerves were now examined with mild concern. Skin that failed to heal, hair that thinned inexplicably, fatigue that resisted tonics. These patterns were acknowledged, though cautiously. Causes were discussed in abstraction rather than specificity. The products themselves remained unnamed. Doctors spoke of accumulation without explanation, of bodies overwhelmed by modernity, of sensitivities intensified by refinement. The implication hovered without landing. Something had changed, but it was not yet clear what should be blamed. This ambiguity protected everyone involved. Physicians could acknowledge harm without indicting their previous advice. Patients could accept concern without confronting the rituals they depended upon. The system preserved itself through vagueness. Treatments shifted subtly. Where stimulation had been encouraged, rest was now suggested, though never too much. Where strong preparations were once praised, gentler alternatives were mentioned, framed as preference rather than necessity. The emphasis moved toward moderation, a word broad enough to accommodate any outcome. Medical journals reflected this caution obliquely. Articles debated sensitivity, constitution, and long-term exposure without naming substances directly. Language remained clinical, detached, careful not to provoke alarm. Progress was reframed as balance rather than advancement. Patients sensed the tension. Trust, once simple, grew complicated. Advice felt less definitive, more provisional. Yet abandoning medical authority was unthinkable. If doctors were uncertain, what hope did anyone else have of understanding the body's decline? Thus, reassurance continued, altered but intact. Doctors adjusted their tone without challenging the foundations of the system they had supported. Concern was acknowledged, but responsibility remained diffuse. The body, meanwhile, continued to register consequence, and in the space between certainty and doubt, harm persisted, quietly, politely, without accusation. What began as maintenance slowly transformed into necessity. The rituals no longer felt optional, nor even corrective. They became stabilizing forces. Without them, the body seemed to falter, the face to unravel. Beauty, once pursued, now had to be sustained at all costs. Skipping a step produced immediate consequence. Without powder, redness surged. Without cream, the skin tightened and cracked. Without tonic, fatigue deepened into something heavier, less manageable. These reactions were interpreted as proof that the rituals were essential. The idea that they might have caused the fragility never quite took hold. Dependence disguised itself as care. The routines were framed as protective measures against a body that could no longer be trusted to function unaided. Products promised balance, restoration, containment. They positioned themselves as supports for a system weakened by time and sensitivity, never as contributors to that weakness. The mirror reinforced this belief relentlessly. With intervention, the face appeared composed. Without it, flaws multiplied. The comparison felt conclusive. Control existed only within. The ritual. Outside it, there was disorder. Medical reassurance adapted to this reality. Doctors spoke of long-term management, of sustaining function rather than restoring it. Certain bodies, they explained, required ongoing support. Withdrawal was discouraged. Abrupt change risked shock. Continuity was safer. Thus, the idea of stopping became frightening. What would remain without these layers of correction? The prospect of seeing the body unmediated felt dangerous, even irresponsible. Dependence was framed as prudence. Over time, the rituals expanded to fill emotional space as well. They offered structure, predictability, a sense of agency in bodies that increasingly resisted control. The act of preparation became calming, familiar, necessary. To remove it would have left not only physical instability, but psychological absence. This dependency deepened quietly. The products multiplied, the time devoted increased, the cost rose. Each addition felt justified, addressing a specific need created by the last. The system fed itself. Thus, beauty ceased to be enhancement, it became infrastructure. The body functioned only when supported by the very practices that weakened it. And in this closed loop, escape felt impossible. Not because the harm was unseen, but because it had become indispensable. Aging was not treated as progression. It was framed as failure. In the Gilded Age, time was tolerated only so long as it remained invisible. Youth was admired not for its vitality, but for its compliance, its smoothness, its predictability, its willingness to hold the shape imposed upon it. When the body began to change despite intervention, the change was not accepted as natural. It was received as a threat. The earliest signs were subtle. Skin lost some of its responsiveness. Creams absorbed more slowly. Powders settled unevenly where they once lay smooth. The mirror, once cooperative, grew less forgiving. What had been corrected easily now resisted persuasion. This resistance provoked alarm. Aging disrupted the promise on which the rituals were built. They had claimed control over color, contour, endurance. When control weakened, confidence followed. The question was no longer how to refine, but how to delay recognition. Time itself became the adversary. Medical language adapted to this fear. Doctors spoke of preservation rather than improvement. The goal shifted from enhancement to maintenance. Decline was acknowledged indirectly, framed as something to be managed discreetly. Remedies promised to support maturity, sustain vitality, protect against deterioration. No one spoke of acceptance. The rituals intensified. What had once been sufficient now felt inadequate. Stronger preparations were introduced. Application became more frequent, more careful, more anxious. Each new line or shadow prompted response. The body's natural signals were drowned beneath correction. Social response sharpened the fear. Aging altered how a woman was seen and how long she was seen at all. Attention waned, invitations thinned, admiration cooled into polite regard. These changes were rarely acknowledged openly, but they were felt acutely. Visibility itself seemed tied to youth. This awareness fed urgency. Aging was not merely personal, it was social. To appear older was to risk irrelevance. The body learned that time carried consequence beyond health. It affected position, influence, and worth. Thus, aging became catastrophe, not because it brought pain, but because it threatened erasure. The rituals promised delay, even as they exhausted the body further. Each attempt to preserve youth demanded more effort, more product, more endurance. In this way, time tightened its grip. The fight against aging deepened dependency, drained resilience, and magnified fear. The body aged regardless, but now it did so under constant surveillance, correction, and alarm. Its natural progression transformed into a crisis that could never be fully resolved. The separation was absolute. In public, perfection was maintained with unwavering discipline. Faces appeared calm, bodies composed, movements deliberate and untroubled. In drawing rooms and at dinners, there was no evidence of strain, only the polished result of hours spent negotiating the body into compliance. What the world saw was stability. What it did not see was cost. Pain was managed in private, treated as an inconvenience rather than a condition. It emerged after doors closed, once the audience had dispersed. Corsets were loosened slowly, the relief arriving alongside a familiar ache. Skin stung when powders were washed away. Muscles protested the release of tension they had held all day. These sensations were endured quietly, without expectation of sympathy. The privacy of pain reinforced its invisibility. There was no language for it in polite conversation. To speak of discomfort risked appearing unrefined, overwhelmed, or ungrateful for the advantages of status. Silence preserved dignity. Endurance preserved position. Medical remedies addressed this private pain without threatening public appearance. Liniments soothed aching backs. Tonics steadied weakness. Sedatives softened nerves strained by constant restraint. These interventions allowed the body to recover just enough to resume performance the following day. Relief was measured not by wellness, but by readiness. This division shaped identity. Women learned to inhabit two versions of themselves, the visible and the concealed. The public body existed for display, managed meticulously to meet expectation. The private body absorbed consequence, tended quietly and without acknowledgement. These selves rarely intersected. Over time, the effort required to maintain this division increased. Pain that once resolved overnight lingered longer. Fatigue deepened. Recovery slowed. Yet the public presentation remained unchanged. The greater the private cost, the more vital the appearance of ease became. Perfection, once achieved, could not be relinquished. The mirror assisted in maintaining this split. It reflected success while concealing sensation. A composed face offered no hint of discomfort beneath. The image reassured even as the body protested. This dissonance normalized suffering. If pain did not alter appearance, it did not warrant disruption. Thus, public perfection thrived on private pain. The system depended on the body's capacity to endure quietly, to absorb damage without display. And so it did, until the separation grew too wide to sustain, and the private cost could no longer be entirely contained. Illusions rarely collapse all at once. They fray. They thin. They fail in small, inconvenient ways that are easy to explain, until explanation itself becomes exhausting. For years, the rituals had promised control. They had delivered it convincingly enough to quiet doubt. But eventually, the mirror began to hesitate. The face no longer responded as expected. Powders settled unevenly, catching on texture that could not be smoothed away. Creams absorbed without effect, leaving the skin unchanged, unimpressed. Rouge no longer coaxed the same bloom. Irritation arrived without color, pain without reward. The familiar exchange, discomfort for improvement, ceased to function. This failure felt deeply unsettling. The rituals had not merely altered appearance, They had structured life. They offered predictability in a body that had been trained to distrust itself. When they stopped working, the loss was not cosmetic alone. It was existential. At first, the response was escalation. New products were sought, their promises more ambitious, their formulations stronger. Advertisements spoke of breakthroughs, of modern refinements that addressed problems older methods could not. Hope resurfaced briefly with each acquisition. The body was given no opportunity to rest. Correction followed correction, each one chasing a result that no longer arrived. Doctors offered careful words. Some spoke of limits, of skin that could no longer tolerate intervention, of systems weakened by long use. These cautions were phrased gently, framed as unfortunate realities rather than consequences. No one named the illusion directly. To do so would have implicated everyone involved. Social reinforcement began to falter as well. Compliments grew rarer, more general. Admiration softened into courtesy. The effort required to maintain the old standards increased, even as the return diminished. The imbalance became impossible to ignore. Privately, acknowledgement crept in. The rituals no longer protected, they exposed. Each application highlighted resistance. Each correction emphasized failure. The body had changed in ways that could not be persuaded back into obedience. This realization carried grief. Not only for lost appearance, but for lost certainty. The illusion had offered safety. The belief that refinement could manage consequence, that discipline could override biology. Its end left vulnerability exposed. Yet even now, abandonment felt impossible. To stop entirely would have meant confronting the body without mediation, without correction, without the familiar scaffolding of ritual. The illusion, though failing, still offered structure. Thus, the end arrived not as rupture, but as quiet recognition. The mirror no longer promised control. The rituals no longer guaranteed outcome. The illusion persisted just long enough to be mourned, then weakened further. Its authority fading, its comfort diminished, leaving behind the undeniable presence of a body no longer willing to be perfected. The portraits were composed with exquisite care. Poses were selected for balance, lighting arranged to flatter, expressions refined until they suggested calm permanence. Oil softened edges that reality could not. Time itself seemed suspended within. Gilded frames, faces preserved at their most obedient moment. These images were offered as truth. They were not. What the portraits showed was result, not process. They captured the final arrangement after hours of preparation, after the body had been negotiated into stillness and the face persuaded into composure. The ache held beneath corsetry did not translate to canvas. The sting of powder, the dryness masked by cream, the fatigue concealed by posture, all of it dissolved under the painter's hand. Artists understood the rules as well as anyone. A sitter's value lay in appearing effortless. Signs of strain were corrected with brush and glaze. Shadows softened, pallor refined. The body was edited into compliance, its resistance erased. What remained was an idealized record of success. These images circulated widely, hung in drawing rooms, passed through families, displayed as evidence of lineage and refinement. They shaped memory as much as reputation. Future generations would look upon them and see elegance without cost, beauty without compromise. The truth remained outside the frame. Photography, when it arrived, continued the illusion in different form. Exposure times demanded stillness. Poses were held with discipline. Retouching smoothed what the lens revealed too clearly. The technology promised honesty, yet delivered the same selectivity. Only what could be controlled was recorded. The absence was telling. No portrait captured the moment after removal, when corsets loosened and breath returned unevenly. No photograph showed the skin inflamed once powders were washed away. No frame preserved the fatigue that followed performance. These realities were never meant to be seen. Medical decline did not appear in portraits either. The slow erosion of resilience, the thinning hair concealed by arrangement, the softened teeth hidden behind closed lips, these were private matters, excluded from representation. The image preserved the ideal long after the body could no longer sustain it. This selective record reinforced belief. If portraits endured, so too must the methods that produced them. The visual archive validated the system, offering proof that refinement worked. Doubt had little ground to stand on when faced with generations of composed faces staring back from walls. Yet the silence within these images was profound. They told only half the story, and that half was carefully curated. What they omitted, the pain, the dependency, the cumulative harm, remained undocumented, carried forward in bodies rather than frames. Thus, the portraits became accomplices. They preserved the illusion for those who came after, offering admiration without context. The cost was forgotten, the consequence obscured, and in their quiet authority they taught a lesson that would persist, that beauty could be fixed in time even when the body that created it could not. Elegance endured because its cost was distributed quietly. No single moment demanded reckoning. There was no singular collapse, no unmistakable turning point that forced recognition. Instead, consequence accumulated gradually, absorbed into routine, softened by habit, and carried privately by bodies trained not to protest. The Gilded Age celebrated refinement as achievement. Elegance signaled control over appetite, posture, expression, time itself. It suggested a mastery that separated the elite from those whose lives were marked visibly by labor and exposure. This distinction was maintained meticulously, not only through wealth, but through discipline enforced daily upon the body. What remained unspoken was how much this mastery required surrender. The body gave up sensation first, learning to ignore discomfort, to reinterpret pain as adjustment. Then it relinquished resilience. Healing slowed, recovery weakened, vitality thinned. Each loss was managed individually, framed as sensitivity, age, or temperament, never as systemic consequence. Medical authority evolved too slowly to intervene meaningfully. By the time caution entered discourse, the practices were deeply embedded. The rituals had become infrastructure, supporting bodies that could no longer function without them. Withdrawal felt dangerous. Dependence was normalized. Society rewarded endurance generously. Those who maintained appearance despite strain were admired. Those who faltered were quietly diminished. This imbalance ensured compliance. Elegance promised security, admiration, and belonging, benefits too valuable to risk by questioning cost. And so the system persisted, self-reinforcing and self-protecting. The harm it caused unfolded too slowly to provoke outrage, too privately to invite reform. Each individual bore her portion alone, convinced that her suffering was personal rather than structural. What survived were the images, the silhouettes, the recorded moments of composure. History remembered the polish, not the price. The bodies that paid it did so without witness, their endurance mistaken for ease. Elegance, in the end, was never free. It was purchased daily through restraint, correction, and silence. And while its surface has endured in memory and art, its cost remains written where it always was, in the quiet deterioration of bodies that were never allowed to rest.